On my first day at Blackwood Academy, I learned that poverty has a sound. It is the sound of shoes too quiet on marble floors, of uniforms worn thin at the elbows, of breathing measured so no one accuses you of taking up too much space. My name is Daniel Hale, and I arrived at the most elite school in the country with a scholarship letter folded so many times it looked like it might tear before I ever did. Blackwood Academy was not built to educate. It was built to separate. The iron gates did not keep danger out. They kept hierarchy in. Students here were heirs, prodigies, legacies of names carved into buildings. Their parents donated wings, laboratories, entire programs. I donated silence. That was the currency I could afford. My scholarship was awarded for academic excellence, a phrase that sounded noble but felt conditional. I knew from the beginning that one mistake would not be forgiven as youthful error but recorded as proof that I never belonged. Teachers smiled politely, classmates smiled cruelly, and the administration smiled strategically. I came from a town where the factory closed before I was born and never reopened. My mother worked double shifts at a nursing home. My father left early, leaving behind only debt and a last name that meant nothing here. When I walked into my dorm room and saw my roommates' imported furniture, I understood immediately that survival would require more than good grades. Elliot Crane was everything I was not. He wore confidence like tailored fabric, spoke as if the world listened by default, and treated rules as suggestions designed for other people. He introduced himself without asking my name first, then laughed when he learned I was on scholarship. Not cruel laughter, just amused, as if I were an interesting statistic. Classes moved faster than any school I had known, not because the material was harder, but because the teachers assumed access. Access to tutors, to technology, to parents who had gone here before. I studied at night while others attended parties. I learned to eat slowly so hunger would not distract me. The first time I was accused of cheating, it was because my test score exceeded expectations. The accusation was quiet, delivered behind closed doors, framed as concern. I provided proof, drafts, notes, reasoning. The teacher apologized, but the record remained. At Blackwood, suspicion sticks longer than truth. I found refuge in the library, a place where books did not care who held them. There I met Mira Patel, another scholarship student, though hers was hidden behind impeccable manners and carefully chosen clothes. She taught me which hallways to avoid and which names to memorize. Survival here, she said, was about pattern recognition. Blackwood ran on unofficial rules. Scholarship students were expected to be grateful, quiet, and exemplary at all times. We were symbols, not individuals. Any failure reflected not just on us, but on the program itself, which administrators defended only as long as it did not threaten donors. The real test came during the Sovereign Project, an annual competition where students formed teams to design solutions to real-world problems. Winners received internships, recommendations, and access. Losers received experience. I was assigned to Elliot's team as the token analyst, the one expected to do the work without claiming the credit. I considered refusing, but refusal at Blackwood is interpreted as incompetence. Instead, I documented everything. Every model, every revision, every late-night calculation. Elliot presented the work as if it emerged fully formed from his vision. The judges applauded. What Elliot did not know was that I had submitted a parallel report to the Faculty Oversight Committee, outlining the methodology and authorship of the project. I did not accuse. I presented evidence. Numbers are harder to intimidate than people. The fallout was slow and quiet. Elliot's internship offer was delayed, then reconsidered. No public apology was issued. Blackwood does not like noise, but something shifted. For the first time, the administration realized that scholarship students could not only endure the system, but understand it. Retaliation followed in subtle forms: funding reviews, stricter evaluations, social isolation. Mira warned me to keep my head down. I agreed publicly and prepared privately. I applied for external competitions, independent grants, any avenue that reduced Blackwood's leverage over me. During my final year, the school faced a scandal unrelated to me, involving misused donations and fabricated outcomes. Suddenly, transparency became fashionable. Scholarship students were invited to panels. I was asked to speak. I stood on stage and told the truth without anger. I spoke about access, about assumptions, about how talent does not flourish in silence but in support. I did not name Elliot or any other student. I named systems. After graduation, Offers arrived from places that cared more about results than pedigree. I chose a public research institute over a private firm, not because it paid more, but because it felt honest. Mira went into policy. Elliot disappeared into a family business. Years later, Blackwood invited me back to speak to new scholarship students. I walked through the same gates, no longer quiet, no longer small. I told them the truth I had learned the hard way. You do not need to become like them to survive. You need to become clearer than they expect. Poverty still has a sound, but so does resilience. It is the sound of footsteps that no longer hesitate, of voices that do not apologize for existing. I learned that at Blackwood Academy, and I carried it with me long after the gates closed behind me. The day after graduation, the first email arrived with a subject line that pretended to be friendly. Follow up regarding your remarks. It was from a Blackwood administrator I had never met, asking me to share supporting anecdotes for the speech I gave about access and assumptions. They wanted my truth in a safer container, something they could polish into a brochure. I replied with a single sentence. I will share data, not anecdotes. Data makes people nervous because it refuses to flatter them. I expected the school to let me fade, but Blackwood does not release symbols easily. They had spent years parading scholarship students as proof of benevolence, and now I had become the uncomfortable kind of proof, the kind that asks what the benevolence costs. A week later, Mira called me from her tiny apartment in the city and said, "They're scrambling." She had accepted an internship with a policy nonprofit and was already collecting stories from other scholarship kids who had left Blackwood quieter than they arrived. "It isn't just you," she said. "They've been shaving numbers for years." The scandal didn't start with a headline. It started with a spreadsheet. A junior accountant in the development office, someone who had never attended Blackwood, someone who didn't have a legacy to protect, noticed that donor funds earmarked for scholarships were being routed through a foundation account and returned as program expenses. It was elegant theft, the kind that hides behind the idea of overhead. The accountant reported it internally. The report vanished. So, the accountant emailed Mira, because Mira had once said something that sounded like a promise. "If you have receipts, I will not let them disappear." Mira asked if I would meet her in person. We sat in a public library, because libraries are one of the few places where you can be poor and still be treated as a citizen. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of ledgers, donation letters, internal memos, and a list of scholarship recipients whose full funding had quietly been reduced mid-year. The school called it adjustment. Kids called it hunger. Mira said, "I think they used the scholarship program to launder money." I looked at the columns, then at Mira. "If we move this," I said, "we have to move it all the way." I had chosen a public research institute partly to escape Blackwood's gravity. It turned out gravity follows you when you carry evidence. I contacted a professor. I trusted an ethics professor who had once apologized to me for a colleague's cheating accusation. He agreed to introduce me to an investigative journalist he knew. But he warned me, "They will try to reframe you as bitter." Bitter is the word institutions use when the harmed speak in complete sentences. I told him, "Let them." Bitterness doesn't alter bank records. The journalist's name was Serena Coe, and she did not do the kind of story that depends on a single source. She did what Blackwood feared most. She triangulated. She found 5 scholarship alumni whose funding had changed without notice. She found 3 donors who believed they were paying for specific students. She found an administrator who had retired early and still carried a low-grade guilt that made him talk. When Serena called me, she didn't ask about my feelings. She asked about timestamps. I liked her immediately. Blackwood's first response was private pressure. I received an invitation to a reunion luncheon at an upscale hotel. The invitation looked like celebration and smelled like containment. When I declined, the head of development called and said, "You're making this adversarial." I replied, "It became adversarial when you treated scholarships like a marketing line item." The caller paused, then said, "You don't understand how institutions work." I said, "I understand exactly how they work. That's why I'm calling it what it is." Then came the legal letter, a defamation warning, written in the cautious language of expensive lawyers. It claimed my statements were harming the school's reputation and demanded I stop contacting donors. I had not contacted donors. I had contacted accountability. The letter was meant to scare me into silence, the same way Blackwood had always used suspicion to keep scholarship students small. I sent the letter to Serena, to Mira, and to a pro bono legal clinic Mira's nonprofit partnered with. The clinic's attorney read it and said, "They're bluffing because they're afraid of discovery." That was the first time I realized that fear can belong to the powerful too. Serena published the story in 3 parts. The first explained the scholarship myth, how Blackwood marketed itself as meritocratic, while quietly rationing aid. The second followed the money. The third named the mechanism, donor restrictions being ignored, scholarship funds being reclassified, outcomes being fabricated for glossy reports. The headline did not mention me. It didn't need to. Still, in the comment sections, strangers found my graduation clip and called me ungrateful, jealous, dramatic. I recognized the pattern. I also recognized that the pattern was weaker now because the story had numbers. Regulators arrived like weather. Not fast, not emotional, but inevitable. The state attorney general opened an inquiry into nonprofit fraud. Donors demanded audits. Parents called the admissions office demanding refunds for ethical damage, which was a new phrase, but not an inaccurate one. Blackwood issued a statement about isolated accounting errors and promised an internal review. Internal reviews are what institutions do when they want to control the conclusion. The attorney general was not interested in conclusions Blackwood wrote for itself. The school tried to make the whistleblower disappear. The junior accountant was placed on administrative leave, then offered severance conditioned on a non-disclosure agreement. Mira arranged legal counsel for them through her nonprofit. When Blackwood's lawyer suggested the accountant should move on, the accountant replied, "I already moved on. I moved the files." Blackwood, for once, did not know where the paper was. Elliot Crane resurfaced during the chaos like a familiar infection. He messaged me on a social platform he had once used only to post vacations. "Man, you really did it," he wrote. "You always had a thing for drama." I stared at the message and felt the old urge to minimize myself for peace. Then I remembered what documentation had taught me. Clarity is peace. I replied, "It's not drama, it's theft. If you want to help, tell the truth about the Sovereign Project. If you don't, stop messaging me." Elliot didn't respond for 2 days. Then he sent one line. "I didn't think it mattered." That sentence explained half of Blackwood. 2 weeks later, Elliot called. His voice was unfamiliar without the audience of privilege. He said his father was furious because the family's name was being mentioned in donor circles. He said the school was asking alumni to sign a letter defending leadership. He said quietly, "They asked me to lie." I waited. Elliot added, "I can't. Not now." I didn't congratulate him. The bar for decency at Blackwood was too low. I said, "If you tell the truth, do it because you mean it, not because your father is embarrassed." Elliot swallowed. "I think I owe you," he said. I answered, "You owe the truth. Start there." Elliot provided Serena with emails showing how administrators pressured faculty to soften scholarship statistics. He also admitted, on record, that he had taken credit for the Sovereign Project, and that the school had minimized the issue to avoid donor discomfort. It wasn't redemption. It was a crack. Cracks let light in, but they also reveal what a structure is made of. Blackwood's board announced a leadership transition. The headmaster retired with gratitude. The development director resigned to pursue new opportunities. These were the polite rituals of consequence. Behind the scenes, the Attorney General's team requested documents, subpoenaed emails, and interviewed scholarship alumni. I was asked to testify. I expected intimidation. Instead, I found something else. Fatigue. Investigators had seen this pattern before, institutions that build prestige by extracting silence from people who can't afford to fight. In my testimony, I described what I had learned as a scholarship kid, that you are asked to be a symbol and punished when you behave like a person. I described the cheating accusation, the way suspicion followed me even after I proved innocence. I described how the Sovereign Project team structure encouraged exploitation. Then I described the ledger Mira showed me. I made it practical. Practical is what turns empathy into policy. After the inquiry became public, Blackwood offered a scholarship advisory council and invited me to join. They framed it as honor. I recognized it as a funnel. Put critics in a committee so you can claim you listened while changing nothing. I told them I would join only if the council had power to audit and veto spending. They replied with careful language about administrative constraints. I replied with my own careful language. Then no. Instead, Mira and I built something outside the school. Mira had policy expertise and a network. I had the habit of evidence. We created a small nonprofit we called Cleargate, because gates can be opened, but only if someone insists on keys. Cleargate's mission was simple: help scholarship students understand their rights, document violations, and connect with legal support. We didn't position it as war. We positioned it as infrastructure. Infrastructure is harder to dismiss than anger. Cleargate's first tool was a template, because templates can travel. It taught students how to log incidents without inflaming them into rumor: date, time, location, witnesses, exact language used, files saved in multiple places. It also taught donors how to verify impact, request itemized reports, ask for third-party audits, refuse vague outcomes. We posted it online. Within a month, we received messages from students at other elite schools describing the same pattern. Prestige, it turned out, is often the same machine, with different paint. Blackwood tried to counter by launching a glossy equity initiative with photos of smiling scholarship kids. They invited donors to a gala. Serena attended and observed that the same administrators who had quietly cut funding were now giving speeches about opportunity. She wrote a follow-up piece titled, "The Cost of a Smile." Blackwood's PR team complained she was negative. Serena replied in print, "Numbers are not negative, they are arithmetic." A settlement eventually came, not because Blackwood found conscience, but because lawsuits are expensive. The school agreed to repay misused scholarship funds, establish independent oversight, and provide restitution to students whose aid had been altered mid-year. It wasn't everything, but it was real. The Attorney General's office framed it as accountability. Blackwood framed it as renewal. I framed it as evidence that pressure works when it is documented and sustained. The quietest moment of victory happened in a grocery store. I was buying discounted produce when my phone buzzed with a message from a student I'd never met. "I used your template," they wrote. "They tried to cut my housing support, but I had everything documented. They reversed it." I stared at the text and felt something I hadn't felt at Blackwood. Relief without fear. Relief that didn't require permission. A year later, Blackwood invited me again to speak, this time to celebrate reform. I considered refusing out of principle, then decided to go for a different reason. The scholarship kids would be there, and they deserved to see someone stand in that place without apologizing. I walked through the iron gates and heard, as always, the sound of hierarchy. But I also heard something new. Footsteps that didn't hesitate. The auditorium was the same. The banners were the same. The smiles were still curated, but in the front row sat students whose elbows were worn thin and whose eyes were too awake. I told them what I had learned beyond Blackwood, that institutions will always prefer you grateful and quiet, because gratitude is a leash when it's demanded. I told them they were allowed to be excellent and still angry. I told them to save receipts. I told them to build friendships that weren't transactional. I told them most of all that survival is not the end goal. Autonomy is. After the speech, a faculty member approached me and said, "You could have been a great leader here if you'd been more cooperative." I smiled the way I used to smile when people wanted me small. "Cooperative with what?" I asked. The faculty member blinked. They had no answer. That was the point. Outside, near the gates, I saw Elliot. He looked older than his age, the way people look when their certainty has been punctured. He said he'd started a scholarship fund in his mother's name. He said he was trying. I told him, "Trying is fine, but systems don't change because one person tries. They change because many people refuse." Elliot nodded like he understood the difference now. And maybe he did. On the train home, Mira called and asked if I regretted any of it. I thought about the nights I studied while others partied, the rooms I entered with my shoulders tight, the way suspicion had tried to become my identity. "No," I said. "I regret the years I almost believed silence was safety." Mira laughed softly. "Good," she said. "Then we keep building keys." The world remained unfair in ordinary ways. Rent still rose. Groceries still cost too much. Rich kids still learned confidence in rooms built for them. But I carried something Blackwood had never offered. The understanding that dignity can be engineered. Not with slogans, but with structure. Not with gratitude, but with preparation. Not with assimilation, but with clarity. I had arrived at Blackwood, donating silence. I left donating something else. Proof that the gates are not gods. They are metal. Metal can be opened. Cleargate grew slowly, which was how we preferred it. Rapid growth attracts people who want credit. Slow growth attracts people who want tools. We began hosting workshops in borrowed classrooms at community colleges, because community colleges know how to stretch resources without pretending it's glamorous. In the first workshop, a student asked, "How do you fight a school that can ruin your future with one email?" I answered, "You don't fight the school as a myth. You fight the decision as a document. We practiced writing emails that were calm but firm, requests that forced administrators to commit to positions in writing. We practiced escalation pathways. We practiced the kind of patience that looks like obedience until the evidence lands. One of our earliest cases involved a scholarship girl at a different academy, Weybridge, who had been accused of stealing a classmate's bracelet. The accusation was convenient because it played into the stereotype donors already believed, that aid recipients are opportunists. The girl insisted she was innocent. The school insisted on punishment. Cleargate helped her reconstruct her movements with library sign-ins, security camera requests, and a time-stamped photo her friend had taken during rehearsal. The bracelet was later found in the accuser's own locker, but the school wanted to avoid conflict by calling it a misunderstanding. The girl didn't accept that. With documentation, she forced a written exoneration. It wasn't revenge, it was oxygen. As these cases accumulated, we started to see a map. The same techniques repeated across institutions. Accuse quietly, punish privately, offer resolution without accountability, demand gratitude for partial repair. The pattern was so consistent that Mira began drafting model legislation for scholarship transparency, a requirement that schools publish audited reports of restricted funds, a ban on mid-year aid reductions without appeal, and whistleblower protections for staff who reported misuse. Some lawmakers smiled politely and called it aspirational. Mira replied, "So was desegregation." In the Public Research Institute where I worked, I built another kind of tool, a statistical model that detected anomalies in scholarship allocation based on tuition, fees, and donor restrictions. It was not magic. It was simple auditing logic turned into code. When we tested it against publicly available data from several schools, it flagged patterns that looked like the same laundering technique Blackwood had used. The model didn't prove guilt. It pointed to where questions should be asked. Questions are the first form of pressure. A foundation officer from a major philanthropic organization reached out after Serena wrote about Cleargate. She said donors were tired of being used as props. She asked if we could help them design grant requirements that were harder for schools to manipulate. We met in a glass conference room, the kind that makes you feel watched. I brought a binder anyway, because binders look boring and boring makes power underestimate you. We proposed 3 requirements: independent audits, student advisory feedback with confidentiality, and public reporting of scholarship, distribution without names, but with categories and totals. The officer nodded. "Schools will hate this," she said. Mira answered, "Then it's working." Not all resistance came from institutions. Sometimes it came from people who had survived by adapting. A scholarship alumnus wrote us an angry email. "You're making it harder for kids now. The school will cut the program because of you." It was a familiar fear, scarcity dressed as caution. I replied carefully, "If a program only exists as long as no one asks where the money goes, it is not a program, it is a performance." The alumnus never wrote back. Maybe they stayed angry. Maybe they reread it when they were less tired. The hardest part of this work wasn't legal battles or policy drafts. It was watching young people absorb the idea that they must earn basic respect. In one workshop, a boy asked if it was okay to refuse a donor dinner invitation. He was afraid that declining would mark him as ungrateful. I told him to write a polite decline and to keep a copy. Then I told him something Blackwood never said to me. "You are allowed to have boundaries, even when you are receiving help. Help is not ownership. Aid is not adoption. You can say thank you without surrendering your dignity." Serena continued covering these stories, but she also warned us about the attention economy. "People love a villain," she said. "They'll try to turn this into a soap opera about bad headmasters and heroic kids." I asked what she recommended. She said, "Keep it unsexy. Keep it about documents. Keep it about process." So we did. We published guides. We hosted trainings. We wrote plain language explanations of common financial tricks. We built boring defenses. Boring defenses are what last. 2 years after the Blackwood settlement, an internal candidate ran for student council president on a platform of restoring tradition. His speeches blamed scholarship students for disrupting culture. He promised a return to merit-based harmony, which was a phrase that meant, go back to silence. Scholarship students organized quietly. They used the tools we taught. They recorded incidents. They filed complaints as groups. They forced meetings with minutes. The candidate lost. Blackwood alumni called it surprising. Scholarship kids called it organized. Mira and I didn't pretend we were saving everyone. We were building ladders and teaching people how to place them. Some people climbed. Some people just needed to know ladders existed. That was enough. The third year brought a personal test I didn't anticipate. My mother fell ill. The nursing home job had worn her down, and the body keeps receipts too. I flew home and sat beside her hospital bed, listening to the beeping machines and the tired kindness of nurses. She apologized for not being able to give me more. I held her hand and told her she had given me everything that mattered: persistence, and the refusal to pretend suffering is normal. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I realized then that my fight with Blackwood had never been only about school. It had been about honoring the life that made me. When my mother recovered enough to return home, I went back to my work with a different clarity. Institutions had tried to teach me that survival is individual. My mother had taught me survival is collective. Communities keep each other alive when systems fail. Cleargate's work was community work in formal clothing. A month later, I received a letter in the mail without a return address. Inside was a handwritten note from the junior accountant who had first flagged Blackwood's laundering. It said, "They wanted me to sign away my voice. I didn't. I took a job at a community foundation. I'm making sure funds go where they're meant to go. Thank you for not letting them bury it." I reread the note twice. It wasn't gratitude that moved me. It was the proof that people can change their trajectories when someone holds the line with them. Blackwood still exists. Of course. Prestige rarely collapses. It mutates. The school rebuilt its narrative, hired a new headmaster, launched a new initiative. They held panels about inclusion and posted photos of diverse faces. Some of it was real, some of it was paint, but the audit mechanisms remained, and so did the oversight. That was the difference between theater and repair. Theater ends when the audience leaves. Repair stays even when no one claps. Sometimes I think about the Daniel who arrived with shoes too quiet on marble floors. I want to tell him that the gates will try to teach him smallness, and he will learn something else instead. He will learn that systems are not mysterious, they are built, and anything built can be examined, measured, and if enough people refuse, reconstructed. On the anniversary of the settlement, Mira and I met Serena for coffee. Serena asked if we believed this work would ever be finished. Mira said, "Not in our lifetime." I said, "Then we build tools that outlive us." Serena smiled. "That," she said, "is the least headline-friendly answer I've ever heard." I shrugged. "Good," I said. "I'm not trying to be a headline." In the fourth year, a university invited me to guest lecture on ethics in data science. The lecture hall was filled with students who looked like they expected a trick, because ethics is often taught like a fable rather than a practice. I told them about Blackwood without naming it, because names can become distractions. I described an algorithm that assigns opportunities based on fit, and how fit becomes a mask for legacy. I described how a single accusation can become a permanent label when you don't have the resources to challenge it. Then I showed them the template. I showed them how to log decisions, how to demand transparency, how to design systems that make exploitation harder. A student raised her hand and asked, "Isn't that cynical?" I answered, "It's not cynical to assume humans will take shortcuts. It's compassionate to build guardrails, so shortcuts don't become harm." After the lecture, a professor pulled me aside. He said his department's scholarship funds were managed by a university office that refused to share itemized reports. He asked what he could do. I told him to submit a formal request, to loop in the university's compliance officer, and to insist on an audit trail. The professor looked stunned, as if he had never considered that institutions can be confronted. I realized then that even people with status can be trained into silence when the system is complex enough. Complexity is often just intimidation dressed as professionalism. Cleargate began partnering with student newspapers, not because we wanted publicity, but because student journalists are often the only ones willing to ask inconvenient questions. We provided workshops on reading budgets, interpreting tax filings, and recognizing the language of evasion. We taught them to listen for phrases like administrative flexibility and strategic reallocation, which often mean money moved away from its promise. We taught them to ask for documents, not quotes. Quotes can be denied. Documents exist. One winter, a donor approached us quietly. He had given millions to an academy that promised to fund rural students. He suspected his money had been used to renovate an athletics facility. "I don't want a scandal," he said. "I just want it fixed." I told him fixing requires visibility. We helped him request an audit, and when the academy refused, He froze future donations and notified other donors. Within a month, the Academy agreed to restructure its reporting. The donor asked if he was doing the right thing. I said, "You're doing the only thing institutions respect, withdrawing unearned trust." There were setbacks, too. A bill Mira helped draft died in committee after lobbyists argued it would discourage philanthropy. A newspaper columnist mocked our work as bureaucratic nitpicking. I wanted to respond with anger, but Mira reminded me, they call it nitpicking because they benefit from the rot. So we kept going. We gathered more data. We built alliances with auditors and consumer protection groups. We waited. Waiting is part of pressure when you refuse to leave. In the 5th year, a new batch of scholarship students at Blackwood reached out. They had heard rumors about what happened, but the school told them it was resolved. They asked if that meant they were safe. I told them safe is not a status you receive. Safe is a practice you maintain. I sent them the template and asked them to form a quiet network. "Don't isolate," I wrote. "Isolation is how they make you believe you are the problem." A week later, one student wrote back, "We made a group chat. We're sharing notes. It already feels different." Sometimes the smallest infrastructure changes everything. I never went back to Blackwood as a student, of course. But I did return once alone, on a day when the campus was empty. I walked past the dorm where Elliot had laughed at my scholarship. I walked past the library where Mira taught me hallways. I stood at the edge of the quad and listened. The marble still amplified footsteps. The buildings still looked like they expected worship, but the gates didn't feel holy anymore. They felt like what they always were, metal shaped by someone's priorities. On my way out, a groundskeeper nodded at me. He didn't know my name. He didn't know the settlement. He just saw a person walking through a place that was supposed to intimidate. That nod, small and ordinary, felt like the truest acknowledgement I had ever received there. Back in my city, I kept working at the Institute, publishing research that had nothing to do with Blackwood models for hospital resource allocation, tools for detecting fraud in public procurement, studies on how stress affects learning outcomes. Yet every project carried the same lesson. When you build systems, you decide who they serve. I had watched Blackwood's system serve legacy. I was determined to build systems that served people who were too often treated as noise. When I thought about success, I no longer pictured acceptance letters or applause. I pictured a scholarship student opening an email, feeling panic, then opening a folder of documentation and feeling steadiness. I pictured a donor refusing a vague report. I pictured an accountant deciding not to sign away the truth. These were not cinematic victories. They were structural ones. In the end, the rule I broke at Blackwood was not academic or behavioral. It was the rule of gratitude as silence. Blackwood wanted scholarship kids to be proof that the system was fair. I became proof that the system could be audited. Poverty still has a sound, yes. But so does accountability. It is the sound of paper sliding across a table, of signatures refusing to disappear, of gates opening because someone learned where the hinges were. The next spring, Cleargate received an invitation to a closed-door roundtable with several school trustees and state officials. The trustees were polite in the way people are polite when they want to appear reasonable. One of them, a man with a watch that looked like a small machine, said, "We agree transparency is important, but you must understand the realities of funding." I asked him what he meant by realities. He said, "Donors can be fickle." I said, "Students can be hungry." The room went silent, as if I had said something rude. Hunger is always rude to people who benefit from ignoring it. A state official asked what we wanted. Mira answered with a list that sounded simple until you understood its implications. Published audited reports, mandatory appeal processes, and whistleblower protections. A trustee smiled and said, "That's a lot of bureaucracy." Mira smiled back. "So is a school," she said. "You just prefer your bureaucracy unaccountable." After the meeting, an older trustee approached me privately. He said he had been at Blackwood for decades and had seen cycles of reform come and go. "The place is too old to change," he said. I looked at him and asked, "If it's too old to change, why does it ask teenagers to change themselves to fit it?" He didn't answer, but his eyes softened in a way that suggested he understood the hypocrisy, even if he couldn't admit it. That summer, Serena sent me a draft of a new article about elite schools quietly outsourcing discipline to third-party character programs that charged fees families could absorb and scholarship kids could not. The programs were marketed as growth. They were punishment. Serena asked if I would comment. I told her the truth. When a system charges money for redemption, it isn't interested in better people, it's interested in better optics. The article sparked emails from parents who insisted their children deserved consequences, and from students who admitted they were terrified of being labeled difficult. I wrote a public statement that said, "Consequences are not the issue. Inequality in consequences is. If two students commit the same violation and only one can afford the path back, the school is not teaching ethics, it is teaching class." In the fall, Cleargate launched a scholarship survival packet for first years. Not inspirational quotes, but practical checklists: how to request accommodations, how to find free tutoring, how to respond to insinuations without escalating, how to keep digital backups, how to choose allies. We included one page titled, "Your worth is not their narrative." It wasn't poetry. It was a reminder that identity can be hijacked by rumor if you don't claim it first. A counselor from a public high school wrote to tell us she used the packet with her students applying to elite programs. She said it helped them feel less naive. I sat with that sentence for a while. Less naive. It sounded like loss. But maybe it was protection. No one should enter a marble hallway believing they will be treated fairly simply because fairness is promised. Promises are not policies. Late one night, I received a message from Elliot. We hadn't spoken in months. He wrote, "I got accepted to a board seat on an education foundation. They want me because of my name. I'm thinking about declining." I read it twice. The old Elliot would never have considered declining a platform. I replied, "Take the seat if you can use it to change the rules. Decline if you'll become their decoration." He responded after a long pause, "How do I know which I'll be?" I typed, "By what you do when they ask you to stay quiet." Elliot stayed on the board. To his credit, he did something unglamorous. He pushed for audit requirements and grants. The board resisted. He persisted. It wasn't a grand moral transformation. It was a series of small votes that made corruption harder. I didn't trust him fully, but I didn't need to. I trusted the mechanism. When oversight is built into funding, personal virtue becomes less important. On the anniversary of my first day at Blackwood, I walked past a local high school and heard a band practicing inside. The notes were messy, brave, imperfect. I remembered the sound of my quiet shoes on marble and realized the difference. The band was allowed to be loud while learning. Blackwood had demanded excellence in silence. That was its cruelty, disguised as standard. I wanted every scholarship kid to have the right to learn loudly. That night, I opened the folder that held my original scholarship letter, the one folded too many times. The paper was soft at the creases. I unfolded it carefully and read the line that once felt conditional: "Awarded for academic excellence." I smiled. Excellence had gotten me through the gates. But it wasn't excellence that had kept me alive there. It was the refusal to let other people define what I owed them. When people ask now what I gained from Blackwood, I don't talk about credentials. I talk about pattern recognition. I talk about evidence. I talk about the moment I understood that institutions are not parents. They do not love you, and they are not entitled to your loyalty. They are arrangements. And arrangements can be renegotiated when enough people stop mistaking tradition for inevitability. The years taught me that dignity is not granted by institutions but constructed daily through choice and preparation. Every obstacle became a lesson in structure. Every slight a reminder to document, to learn, to outlast. I stopped measuring myself against those who inherited certainty and began measuring myself against the version of me who almost believed silence was safety. And when I returned to the gates one last time, I left them behind without lowering my voice. I used to think the most dangerous thing at Blackwood was cruelty. Now I think it was the lesson that cruelty is normal. Once you accept that lesson, you stop asking for fairness and start bargaining for scraps. I refuse that bargain.